everyone, and thank you for joining the session early. I'd like to welcome all of us to day 2 of the 2022 Stanbic IBTC webinar series. My name is Nike Vajomo. I'm an executive director at Stanbic IBTC Pension Managers Limited, and I will be moderating this session. This afternoon, we will focus on the political terrain, and the theme for today is the election cycle, development, and the nature of economic voting. To kick off this event, I would like to invite the CE, Stanbic IBTC Holdings, Dr. Demola Shogunle, to give the opening remarks and introduce the speakers. Let's make welcome Dr. Demola Shogunle with a resounding round of applause, or digital resounding round of applause, as he mounts the digital podium. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Nike. I hope everybody can hear me and see me. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I would like to, thank you so much, and to show our appreciation. We don't take it for granted, for setting out time to be able to join us. This is the day 2 of Nigeria Investors webinar that we are hosting. The important thing is that we are very grateful, for all the, tremendous support that you've shown us over the years. And to be quite frank, the important thing is that we are really pleased to be able to connect, directly with you, all of you, post-COVID, to be able to discuss, very topical issues, real, issues of importance. This topic, this webinar could not have come, at a better time. 2022 being a pre-election year for Nigeria. And we would like to thank, all our speakers also, and business leaders, who have decided to join us. I believe personally, that, we will get a lot of, what we call takeaways, from this engagement. And it promises to be very, very, very enlightening and very, very enriching. Thank you once again, for joining us. So I revert back to you, Nike. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doc, for the warm welcome. We have 2 renowned speakers with us today, this afternoon, and I would quickly take on their to read out their profiles to us. We are privileged to have them, and I don't think there's any better person or persons to do justice to the topic of today, given their experience on the terrain and what they do. We have with us Professor Pat Utomi, founder and CEO for Center for Values in Leadership. Professor Utomi, sir, could you please put on your camera so viewers can see you?
Yes, let Prof put on his camera. I will just, Nike, please bear with me. Let me run quickly through the, the profile, of Prof.
Okay.
Professor Utomi, political economist, professor of entrepreneurship, is founder and chief executive officer of the Center for Values in Leadership, CVL, a fellow of the Institute of Management Consultants of Nigeria, and founding senior faculty, of the Lagos Business School, Pan Atlantic University, and chairman and chief executive of what we call the Integrated, Produce City, IPC, as well as executive vice chairman of Smart City Lagos, a joint holding with Dubai Holdings. And the important thing is that, he has served, on various boards, one of them, African board of leading global professional service firm, Deloitte, and was director of the Center for Applied Economics at the Lagos Business School. He has served in senior positions in government, as an advisor to the President of Nigeria, the private sector. He has also served as Chief Operating Officer, for Legacy Volkswagen of Nigeria, and also in the academia. Is the author of several, and I would say several important management and public policy books, including, the award-winning Managing Uncertainty. Another one, Competition and Strategy in Emerging Economics. That was in 1998. And the 2006 book, Why Nations Are Poor. Very, very interesting book. The Art of Leading, that one was published in 2016, as well as Why Not, published in 2019. Prof, is the chairman of, what we call PAF Track, PAFTRAC. That's the Pan-African Private Sector Trade and Investment Committee, sponsored by the AU and Afreximbank. He has passionately pursued, the building of a viable opposition political party in Nigeria. And when it comes to, and when you are talking about transparency and accountability in government, an aspirant, for president and for the post of president of Nigeria, I think in 2007 and 2011, is a man of faith, a family man who is widely traveled, even as we speak now. He is in one of those continents. He has visited, over 80 countries. So, Prof, you are welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. It's such a great pleasure to be able to join this interesting webinar.
Thank you.
So I hope I'm visible now. You can see me.
Loud and clear. We can see you, Prof.
See and hear me. Okay.
Yeah. Nick, do you want to go?
Do I get to start making comments now?
Not yet. We need to introduce.
Okay.
Yes, we need to introduce another panelist. Nick.
All right.
Nick, you are muted. You are muted.
So far.
Nick, you are still muted. You are still muted. Okay, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, what I will do is to go through very quickly. Maybe she's having some technical issues. I will introduce, another distinguished, panelist, and Dr. Joshua Bolariwa. I mean, he's the head Division of Security and Strategic Studies, Research and Studies Department, Nigeria Institute of International Affairs, Lagos, Nigeria. He is a what we call, FES, an International Peace Academy, scholar. He teaches international relations, strategic studies, peace studies, and conflict resolution in many universities in Nigeria, including the University of Lagos and Lagos State University, among others. He is a visiting scholar to the University of Calgary, Canada. He was editor, Nigeria Forum, an opinion, journal of the Institute, 2011 to 2016. The book review editor, 2011 to 2019. And also the current editor of the Nigerian Journal of International Affairs, NJIA, 2019 to date. His research interests include security, defense and strategic studies, peace and conflict resolution, post-conflict reconstruction and peace building, gender studies, humanitarian intervention, refugee studies, internally displaced persons, IDPs, migration, and development, studies. He has attended, several national and international conferences, seminars, and workshops. Dr. Bolariwa, has published widely in many areas, which include international relations, strategic studies, peace studies, gender, peacekeeping, post-conflict reconstruction, corruption, migration, human trafficking, elections, democracy, and developmental issues. is published, either in chapters or books, monographs, and books from locally and internationally, recognized, platforms. He has both administrative and academic, experiences. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, these are our two panelists. As I've said, thank you for taking time, to join us today. I'm very sure there'll be a lot of, what we call takeaways from this interaction, from this engagement, given, the caliber and the experiential background, of our, invited guests and panelists. So we are not taking your time for granted. We know it should be around what now? Around 2:46 p.m. in Joburg, 3:46 p.m. in Nairobi, 4:46 p.m. in Dubai. It should be around 8:46 p.m. in Beijing, and it should be 8:46 a.m. In New York, and 5:46 a.m. in the West Coast. So, ladies and gentlemen, these are the two panelists for us, and fasten your seatbelts and enjoy it. I go back to you, Nike. I hope you can talk now freely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doc, and I hope I'm audible now. I apologize for the technical hitch. So thank you very much, Doc, for the opening remarks and excellent introduction of our speakers for today. I believe we're in for a good time in terms of information, and that will also help to drive, things we're going to be doing, whether in our personal lives or what we should look forward to in our business lives. But before we get right into it, a few housekeeping rules. I would like for all of us to please mute our systems to avoid interruptions during the course of the presentations and, of course, the question and answers. I will also request that we be patient with our questions. As many questions as we would like to put forward, please put them in the Q&A. We'll take the presentations first, and then we'll have the question and answer session thereafter. At this point, I will hand over to our speakers as we begin the conversation on the election cycle, development, and nature of economic voting. Please make welcome Professor Pat Utomi to the digital podium. Prof, you might need to unmute yourself and your camera, sir.
Yes, we can see you now and we can hear you, Prof.
You can hear me? Yeah.
You are muted again, Prof. You are muted. Apologies.
This has a mind of its own.
Now we can hear you. Please don't.
You can hear me?
Yes.
I still
we
have
can hear you, sir.
It's muted.
But we can hear you.
You can hear me now? Okay,
yes.
Lovely.
Yes, we can.
I'm just saying that it's a great pleasure to be able to join in this conversation, which I think is truly important. First of all, let me quickly say that a number of factors are important in looking at possibilities of trends in policy following election cycles. The kinds of emphasis that may come will be a function of, one, the structure and nature of political parties and the role they play in influencing play. Well, I can tell you that this is an area of severe challenge at this point in Nigeria's history, but I'll come back to this. Now, the disposition of the chief executive, the president, is very, very important. The presidency in Nigeria is a very, very powerful one. The way that the Nigerian system has evolved makes even just signaling by a president very significant for the direction that policy travels. So the chief executive officer is critical to understanding policy trends. The nature of the team that the president picks in terms of his cabinet and advisors, how important advisors are relative to, say, cabinet ministers. It's very important, and I can point to trends in this regard. And the challenge of vision to reliance for knowledge, basic knowledge of how things should be done on either local intellectuals or some foreign base. We will find, for example, that increasingly for choice in our country, there is a lot more reliance today on external sources. And so you will get a lot more out of Washington influencing things than ordinarily would be the case, say, 30 years ago, when we had a very strong local public intellectual community that influenced policy significantly. I think I'll speak to some of this in the course of the presentations. But first, let me talk about the political parties. And ordinarily, political parties develop positions, a policy plank on many of the issues that then influence how policy is implemented when their party is in power. Unfortunately, what we have in Nigeria is primarily machine politics. Political parties are essentially machines for winning elections, and very, very little work so far is being done. I mean, there's a lot of pressure to change it, to get the participants in the process to engage with the issues in this round, but that has not been quite the case in our recent history. Perhaps I should say a thing or two about how I connect to the evolution of this whole process in the last few years. When General Obasanjo was running for president in 1998, he picked a policy team that was to advise him and help him develop positions. I had the privilege of being chair of that policy team, working with people like Ayo Teriba, Dr. Teriba. Ifweko Moigi was a rapporteur secretary of our group, and we met every day with candidate Obasanjo until his nomination going forward. Fairly interestingly, he was succeeded by President Yaradua, who then invited me once to a personal dialogue on where the country should be traveling, and incredible insights from that long discussion that we both had, and what could have been if he did not die, but that's another story. But and then the struggle to replace him, I became, for some reason, entangled in that struggle when Yaradua took very ill and was dying, and then helped prepare a document for Goodluck Jonathan with a team that included a number of people back then. And then, of course, I had an attitude problem very early with the team, or with the president himself, and I sat back. So what I'm trying to say about this is that I have been somehow, by circumstance or happenstance, somehow close to how these things have evolved, and do have some insights that I can share on why these are the factors that determine the direction of travel. But on a more broadly global basis, Nigeria was the dirigist state back in the 70s. The environment was shaped by the fact that some of the smart civil servants that returned to the country at the time of independence were majorly people who went to the London School of Economics, influenced by Fabian socialism and Harold Lasky. And when oil kicked in as a major factor in Nigeria's evolution under military rule, what I like to call the alchemy of soldiers and oil. They got even more empowered with resources flowing from oil. And the argument they made back in the 70s, the so-called super permanent secretaries, and I wrote a PhD thesis working with them in the beginning of the 1980s, spending quite a bit of time with some of them around 1980, 81. The super permanent secretaries actually argued for what they called government taking the commanding heights of the economy. That general philosophy affected things in a way that led to a structural logjam, given the volatilities of oil prices. By 1982, Nigeria was in very serious trouble. The dirigi state needed to be unwound, and the politics of military rule made that a big challenge. The incumbent was in office at the time, and the discussions were very difficult. Nigeria had to turn to counter trade with Brazil and others to not to fall into the Venezuela trap, if you will. However, with a great deal of adroitness, history will eventually write this more correctly because other things make him a difficult historic character. General Ibrahim Babangida managed, either because he understood the issues or because he was influenced by some group of people, to turn to a structural adjustment program that helped us begin to create markets in place of controls. And ultimately, the pressure of moving towards markets was facilitated, in my view, by a conference that took place in Nairobi in Kenya in 1985. That was sponsored by the Aga Khan Foundation on a tripartite approach to development, in which the private sector, the public sector, and PDAs, private development agencies, or the social enterprise sector, were seen as partners that needed to work together to influence the policy environment and make the country move forward. Very interestingly, the Nigerians that went to that conference, the leading private sector person at that time was the chief executive of the UAC of Nigeria, Chief Ernest Shonekan. The public sector was led by a very powerful permanent secretary called Alhaji Abubakar Alhaji. And then the third person from the NGO sector was led by a gentleman called Jack, Dr. Jack. And on their return, we started what was called an Enabling Environment Forum, in which these three sectors could dialogue and shape the direction of policy. That group got a boost when shortly after, in the middle of a transition crisis, Chief Ernest Shonekan was named head of government. And Chief Shonekan then called for a Nigerian Economic Summit, driven by this Enabling Environment Forum. And out of it came what is now known as the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. And the idea of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group was therefore to try and influence direction of policy. I remember the first economic summit. We had people from Shell, scenario planners from Shell in the UK, and walked through scenarios. And in the end, an acronym came out of it. Between open borders and being locked back in, there was evidently, from our conversations, no alternative. So what came out of that was called Tina. There is no alternative. And so the song of that season was There is no alternative. So Nigeria began to move towards markets. The economy began to open up and to travel that path. Well, as the military began to retreat in 1998, and Obasanjo was coming in, and as I said, I led his policy team. And it's a story, I'll still get to the book, that describes that experience and the battles between him and I and pushback. He was originally more of a closed borders kind of person. But one of the great things about the Obasanjo experience is that he picks up. Once he became convinced that the way to go was to privatize and do a few things, he became the ultimate disciple of privatization and all of that. But how was policy influenced? A number of things to understand how policy was influenced under Obasanjo. First, because he had been head of state previously, knew some global figures, he liked to respond to the fact that he was globally networked. One of his first major policies, which I liked very much, actually came from influence from Jeffrey Sachs. Jeff Sachs used to run the center at Harvard at the time. That was before he moved to the Earth Institute in Columbia. And Jeff's thesis was that one of the reasons that we produce so poorly in Africa was malaria. Malaria, I mean, this big argument in development economics about why Africa's growth was slow back in those days, why people like Paul Collier at Oxford said the problem was policy. African leaders were making the wrong policy choices. Jeff argued that malaria and geography, really, because of Africa's location, were impacting Africa's ability to produce. Of course, I didn't agree with Jeff overall. I was more of a Collier person in that conversation. However, the point was that malaria was a very big problem. It's still a very big problem. More people die every year in Nigeria of malaria than any other thing. So Jeff's prescription led to Obasanjo's first major policy, roll back malaria. Again, unfortunately, I don't think that we sustained those policies, and I think it's one of the big issues I would be pushing on the agenda for this coming elections season. But the fact of Obasanjo's networking affected him negatively, in my view, in terms of the choices he made, because he quickly empaneled a group of advisors led by Linda Choka. He had McNamara. I had the good fortune of knowing all of these people fairly well personally. I knew McNamara was very old at the time, had even gotten to levels of dementia and stuff like that. Linda Choka made her best efforts, but that was not the best source of advice. And Obasanjo really relied so much on their shaping the agenda. So that was the Obasanjo era. Yar'Adua, was an Obasanjo peak as president. So you would therefore expect continuity. But once Yar'Adua got in office, people complained about the many things that went wrong under Obasanjo, and Yar'Adua began to push back instead of the continuity that was expected. In fact, as recently as 2 weeks ago, I was with General Obasanjo at something he hosted, and he still showed elements of, shall I call it, discomfort, bitterness, not being able to understand why his policies were pushed back so strongly on by a successor that he literally handpicked. So understanding policy and trends they will take also involves understanding the nature of the transition, in addition to understanding the people themselves who are in power, what their big idea is, and this is important as we watch those who are lining up to run for office. Again, I think that if you go past Yar'Adua and you go to his successor, Jonathan, a very important learning point is whether the person is somebody who has had a certain worldview that was known, or was just a politician in this machine politics of, okay, what goes? I just need power, and I need to be able to do the much I can with power, without any clear ideological disposition or even understanding of how the world functions. I think, interestingly, from my short interaction with Yar'Adua. He was a very disciplined mind. If he got people who influenced him properly, I mean, the long conversation I had with him was about him trying to persuade me to join his cabinet, and I was pushing back on it, and he was enormously persuasive. And I remember I said to him, look, in the cooperative state in Africa, where you incorporate a voice that is a voice of dissent, sometimes it just quashes the person's voice. And I didn't want to be a victim, if you will. I said, get 7 good people, give them key ministries, then you can play politics with the other ministries, and get these 7 people with you to agree on direction of travel for the country and all of that. And he was committed to implementing that. Unfortunately, he died just shortly after that. And Yar'Adua succeeded by Jonathan, who then was preoccupied with political survival. And that influenced more the choices that he made than any clear thinking about where the country should travel. He thought if he had 1 or 2 key people in positions, those people will get things going in that right direction, which brings me to the point of teams. The kind of team that they pick will tell you the kind of direction they will travel. When Obasanjo became significantly challenged, he chose to pick a certain team. They had internal competition issues amongst them, but generally it was a Washington consensus-oriented team. And that more or less influenced the track of travel of policy after his first term. I think that if you then go past the Jonathan era into this one, what drove the current era was really the pursuit of power, And again, I somehow got trapped into it because I was asked, along with 2 or 3 others, including the incumbent vice president, to lead a preparation of a roadmap for the party. And we did that, but you can see that because power was the dominant issue, the attention to the roadmap that we drew was fairly limited. Again, the vice president was constrained in his role in the government to influence certain things. One single thing that came out of our work that they tried to implement was the adaptation of the Bossa Familia ideas of conditional cash transfers. Well, the implementation is something else we can talk to, but this is where the influence came from. I actually introduced that into the so-called track of travel for the party. So what do I think the next round will bring us? We come at a time when, unfortunately, there are some big challenges, but also at a time when there is extraordinary promise. I think that if we look at Nigeria, most of the good things that have happened in spite of government, not because of government. And that space, I think, will continue to expand, and government will begin to run after those spaces that are looking like they are making progress to provide support. And I'll give you a very simple example. The tech space. Very talented young Nigerians began to open up a space with very limited support or even understanding of what was going on from government. Well, we had a communication minister who had a pretty decent understanding, and she made an effort to begin to try and engage that space. When she left, things seemed to like peter down some, but by a late part of last year, I mean, again, I can share with some of, I had the privilege of leading planning retreats for 2 government agencies, the NCC, Communications Commission, and the Technology Development Agency, NIDA. And out of the conversations we had at those retreats, they were reminded to make some effort to engage this space. And then the minister jumps on it and says, look, I want to come to Lagos and meet the unicorns. We had to quickly say to him, it's not about unicorns, it's about building the whole space. And he took something out of that, came into Lagos, met with more than 200 startup players in the tech space a couple of weeks ago. And so you're going to see the entrepreneurial drive of Nigerians leading and government responding almost as a follower to try and make that space work better. But having said that, there is a deliberate move by groups of Nigerians, myself included, to say that we cannot continue to travel like this. We must have clear ideas of policy direction. Modernity and democracy are defined fundamentally, if you take the Jürgen Habermas thinking, by rational public conversation. How do we establish that to make every player who goes on the arena put down his position and have a conversation of that, and that be used to hold them accountable? I think that if the effort of that group that I am part of succeeds, then we will know very clearly what direction whoever is coming next will travel. But I think that they will be largely borrowing from whatever comes onto that table in the public sphere during this conversation. And for me, I think that issues like education, where we must massively invest in rethinking education, will be very, very important. I argue for a development strategy that takes factor endowments and looks at latent comparative advantage and how global value chains can be built off of these, going down to local governments, and how education will be shaped by that purpose of, those value chains that we want to significantly add value in and grow those local endowments, whether it's sesame seed in some part of the country or the other. You're going to see massive pressures around electric power. It has been a disaster, quite frankly. And the problems will go back to Obasanjo, and we argued those matters back then, but that we have not managed to advance past them shows the failure of taking the success in telecommunications for friends, to think that such deregulation would mean opportunity for, the state capture to advance the interest of their friends. The failure of that is evident. So we're going to see perhaps more pressure to liberalize on power, and bring in those who know what they're doing, have the capacity to do it, to come and do it. I think that they will be under a lot of pressure, besides education and healthcare, to advance. But if you want to talk about healthcare, one of the biggest failings of the current order is that part of what we asked of them was that there should be, Nigeria should become a center of medical tourism rather than the kind of outflow we're having. Working with the private sector, essentially inspiring private sector initiative to get in each of the Nigeria so-called geopolitical zones a world-class hospital center, something like the Texas Medical Center. I think that there are enough Nigerian, 70% of all the black doctors in America are Nigerian. There's enough power, brain power in the diaspora to do exactly what the Indian doctors did in India with healthcare. And you will see an inclination more in that general direction, so that other sectors that have shown promise of their own, purely entrepreneurial outcomes, retarded by infrastructure, will essentially begin to get more attention, whether it's the entertainment sector, with music and film, is Nollywood, again, the tech space. But we will see the infrastructure responded to more by markets evolving, the so-called prosperity paradox. I expect to really bloom and make a difference in what happens going forward. Perhaps I wasn't given how much time to speak, so I better not go on for much longer than my welcome to say, but I can come back in if needed and say, but generally speaking, the factors that will determine the direction of policy, the political parties, very, very weak, no clear policy direction. And so the very powerful president we have, depending on who he is and who his close associates are, will significantly shape policy. Global trends will always impact policy because the herd mentality of going with the flow matters. After, we'll be making a lot of play as it begins to settle down, the African Continental Free Trade Area. That might influence a number of things. I think Nigerian professionals who are very strong in many areas might begin to go out into other African countries, and this might create new general directions. And then I think depending on who emerges and how much that person understands things, the question of whether Washington is making the influencing general direction of policy, or intellectuals that are local or diaspora. I think this matters so much. I beat up on many of my friends who got into power in recent years about this. The difference, I was in Kuala Lumpur during the Asian financial crisis in 1997. And the difference that Mahathir Mohamad's response to the big fight with George Soros was a function of his reliance on local intellectual power in Malaysia. Nigerian leaders have been unable to do this for a generation now. Babangida did a pretty good job of that with his PAC, having their Boya days and so on and so forth together. In the civilian era, we've not been able to focus on local intellectual power, most of who have become very, what's the word, tired of the system, if you will. But I think if there's smart new leadership, effort will be made to connect up with the intellectual diaspora and local intellectual base. And that might shape things perhaps sort of going forward as against this complete reliance on whatever is thrown out from Washington, the World Bank Group and the likes. So is that okay? I pause here now because to leave me is dangerous. I can go for the next 2 hours.
Thank you very much, sir, Prof. Clearly, this is a topic you're very passionate about. And I think some of the key takeaways, I took copious note as you spoke, are the important factors to consider as we make this transition, the things that would make or mar, what we eventually come up with in 2024. And then some of them are the structure and nature of political parties and the role they play influences whatever happens. You did also mention that part of the challenge is that a lot of them are more involved in winning the elections rather than in policy formulation and, thinking through implementation of those policies. So that might be a challenge. The disposition of the current president is important, and I think we all know that. In addition, the nature of the team the president picks, the cabinet ministers and the advisors are also critical to shaping, what happens in the country after the elections. Also, the challenge of reliance on how things should be done locally and internationally would also be a critical success factor as we go along. So much said. Thank you very much, sir. I would yield the floor to Dr. Bolarinwa, and we will hear his perspectives, and then we'll go to the question and answers. Dr. Bolaimo, you're welcome to the podium. You have to unmute, sir. I'm not sure you've unmuted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nike. And importantly, I also want to greet and appreciate distinguished Professor Patitomi. That was a good presentation, sir. So well done, sir. So I will be speaking. Prof has spoken on policy, disposition of the leadership, what we actually expect from them. I will be speaking more on elections. I want to speak more on the elections and the electoral process in Nigeria with just like Prof had put it in perspective, like with a searchlight on the 2023 general elections. In every democracy, elections serve as important mechanism and viable means that ensure orderliness in the process of leadership, succession, and change. Elections give legitimacy and political authority to every administration. Elections also play dominant roles. They play dominant roles in democracy, and these roles are widely circumscribed in terms of portraying the popular will of the people, inculcating political changes, and also actualizing regimes' legitimacy. So if elections are done in the proper way, conducted in a proper way, is in a very smooth way, devoid of rancor and some other skirmishes, it allows for legitimacy. And such legitimacy ensures people's political support for such regimes. So it is for this reason that modern democratic practice is very particular about the way elections are conducted. The way elections are conducted. And basically, the integrity and credibility of elections are crucial in determining the extent to which people can freely elect those who will represent them in a democratic government, and this will in turn facilitate a good atmosphere for economic development and some other policy actualizations, as Prof had earlier put it. But generally, in this part of the world, elections, even in some other parts of the world, but majorly in this part of the world, the integrity of elections are always undermined or compromised in different ways. And these eventually, after such elections, the political environment, the economic environment, the entire climate becomes heated up, leading to crisis and creating a lot of problems, particularly in Nigeria. Nigeria's electoral process has always been known for its chaotic nature, and it has always been at the heart of this quagmire, affecting investment, affecting a lot of other things. But the problem have always been there, manifesting itself in different styles, in different forms, in different ways. For example, in the First Republic, one of those problems, one of those challenges which has affected our electoral process, particularly election itself or elections generally, right from 1960, is there are the issues which are involved over the year manifesting itself and trying to talk about vote buying, election rigging, party not being organized very well, party not having clear-cut manifestos, party having problems of even electing or choosing their leaders. And those leaders, or even such parties, just like Prof mentioned earlier, they are only concerned about winning elections, but they are not ready to put up policies that will change the economic environment, the political environment, what the people expect, what the people want to enjoy, why they are voted in, and all of that. In the First Republic, there was a problem or challenge of vote buying through food distribution or food items being distributed. The same thing happened in the Second Republic, where the same thing was intensified, and where pre-election time money distribution to induce voters to do all of these things, and before you know it now, the right leaders are not elected, they are not put in place, or leaders without visions are now they are put in place because they do this through massive rigging, buying of so many things. Apart from that, specifically elections in Nigeria's Fourth Republic have been characterized by vote buying, economic voting, rigging, ballot snatching, to the extent that Wood Bratton had described this as an epiphenomenal dimension of the Nigerian election process, because they are marred by so many problems, as mentioned. Apart from that, certain factors from studies have been identified why our election process, or why our elections have always been marred by so many problems, challenges, vote buying, rigging, so many other things, snatching of ballot boxes, and that the incidence of poverty, desperation of politicians, illiteracy, high return of elective posts, complicity of security operatives and electoral officials, as well as the willingness of electors to sell their votes, have been identified to be at the base of so many anomalies which have affected the Nigerian elections, even right from 1960, especially in this Fourth Republic. Now, moving quickly ahead, I try to also look at some of these common concepts mentioned which have been affecting elections in Nigeria over the decades. The first thing I mentioned is economic voting. Economic voting refers to a behavioral phenomena, namely that changes in economic conditions or in their perceptions, which supposedly lead to changes in individual voting preferences, and via that in the election outcomes. So in other words, economic voting affects the way the election goes, or people's choice or choices. It has been argued that economic voting constitutes a mechanism of electoral accountability that spurs government to meet the policy goals, of the public. So traditionally, economic voting claims that voters cast ballots. They cast their ballots for incumbents with successive economic performance, whereas the electorates, they withdraw their electoral support for those with poor economic performance. Though that is in theory, but the political reality, however, does not correspond with the ideal conditions of the economic voting theory. You know, there is this direct influence of economic conditions on electoral support for incumbents, which is also not automatic in some cases. Many studies on democratization have been able to say this, but the fact remains that economic development has a strong positive association with democracy and with democratic transition or regime changes. Then another one I mentioned quickly is vote buying, or what they call vote trading in Nigeria's elections over time. Vote buying or vote trading. You know, vote buying or vote trading is an electoral fraud, and such as vote buying or vote trading is a growing practice that seriously undermines the integrity of elections in so many democracies. This practice manifests itself in different forms in different democracies, in so many democracies around the world. Vote buying afflicts both established democracies, such as the United States, and even also other fledgling democracies in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. The problem is that vote buying's prevalence in Africa's fragile democracies is now a matter of growing concern. And these are really affected. In a study we did for about 36 countries in Africa, we discovered that 80% from 36 countries in Africa believe that voters are bribed. This bribing takes place, some at the polling booths, some the night before the elections, some even during the electioneering campaigns, some even while people are on their way to go and vote at the polling unit or at the booth. So a lot of these, a lot of studies, and some of the studies we did recently have revealed this in about 36 countries out of about 54 or 55 countries in Africa. In fact, those studies have told us that 16% of the voters reported being offered financial or material favors in exchange for their votes. Although the use of vote buying in Nigeria predates the return of democracy in 1999, the phenomenon has recently increased in dimension, in penetration, and sophistication. Several videos and images have revealed all of this that we have seen in some recent elections in form of food items being distributed, pictures being put on them, and again, money, gratification, other valuable items are given by politicians, party agents, in a bid to influence them to vote for their own candidates. We saw this. I was one of the election observers in some of the elections we have had since about 2011. I've been observing elections, and in those recent ones we have done, evidence abounds in these practices during the state of cycle elections that we had in Alambra in 2017, Ekiti 2016, Ekiti July 2018, Osun September 2018, Edo September 2016, as well as the main 2019 general election. So that was, we had a lot of brazen use of monetary and material inducements to influence voters' choices. And this had led to characterization of our electoral politics in Nigeria as cash and carry democracy. It's been described as cash and carry democracy. And this development also represents a potent threat to Nigeria's democracy if it is not urgently addressed. Again, I also discussed electoral rigging. Electoral rigging is also one of the major threats to Nigeria's election and nascent democracy. You know, rigging manifests itself in different ways. Is such illegalities committed with a corrupt, fraudulent, and sinister motive to influence an election in favor of a candidate. All of these, we have seen in all our elections since 1964, 65, 79, 83, 99, 2003, 2007, 2011, up to 2019. I also discussed about increased improvements in the electoral process. And one of those improvements in the electoral process in Nigeria that we hope to witness in 2023 is the signing of the Electoral Act of 2022. The Electoral Act was signed on February 25, 2022 by President Muhammadu Buhari. And this act repeals the Electoral Act number 6 of 2010. And it enacts the Electoral Act of 2022 by repealing that of 2020. And that act is aimed to regulate the conduct of federal, states, and area council elections, also to make provisions for the restriction of the qualification for elective office to relevant positions of the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria 1999 as amended. Also talk about the use of card readers and other technological devices in elections and political parties too. And primaries, to provide a timeline for submission of lists of candidates, criteria for submission of candidates, limit of campaign expenses, and address the omission of names of candidates or that of logo of political parties. All of these have been taken care of in the new Electoral Act. One major takeaway in the Electoral Act is the clause 84 that the president, the current president, President Buhari, wrote into the National Assembly to amend, which is still being seriously discussed too. Then I discussed about party primaries and all of that, and majorly party primaries and other modes of candidate selection are a crucial institution in many democracies, and you cannot do elections without party primaries. And that talks about party organization too. So where they exist, particularly in parties of government, these procedures serve as constraint to option for electorates to know the candidates of certain parties they want to vote for in the election. But the competitive fairness of party primaries reveals the degree to which parties permit participation and reflect the aspirations of a wide array of citizens. So it is a fact now that political parties are trying to conduct their party primaries, and this may begin from May 2022, because presently now no political party has conducted its primaries to choose its own candidate for election of 2023, but that may begin from May next month, 2023, because in order to follow the stipulated timeline given by the new Electoral Act. I also I brought some tips about those party primaries. They are there. I wouldn't know because of time. I may not want to go through them, but they're about 10. But at least a political party in its primary can choose to either conduct a direct, which is general, or an indirect delegate primaries. So, for example, we have seen in the dailies that the ruling party, APC, had announced that their party primary that will be done towards the end of May next month, at the end of May next month, they will use indirect. They will use indirect primary. They will follow indirect primary, and that's what they have decided to do. So there are also so many other things that I said. There's also the issue of election results will be transmitted electronically. Electronically, it will not be written down again in a paper where you and I can manipulate between the polling booths and the collation center. That will not happen again. It has to be right there at the polling booth where the election have been cast. You just transmit the results straight to the general portal or server where they will see. Then the card readers will be connected to an INEC mother server at the headquarters and automatically corresponding the results from the PU according to the new electoral law. So all of these are some of the few takeaway from those things. I also mentioned some of the political gladiators who had come out, or major aspirants for elections, party to party. But the major ones that we know, the ruling party, we have Asiwaju Ahmed Tinubu, we have the incumbent vice president, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, also coming out. Chief Rotimi Amechi, the Minister of Transportation, Senator Rochas Okorocha, and some other notable bigwigs coming out under the ruling party. Under PDP, we have seen Mr. Peter Obi, we have seen Senator Bukola Saraki, Pius Ayim, and some other notable Nigerians. Under some other political parties too, which I mentioned about up to 10. Again, Nigeria runs a multi-party system. But moving towards concluding my paper so that we can allow for this thing, I tried to look at the likely effect of 2023 general elections on investment climate. And I tried to say politics and economy are interconnected. You cannot separate them. Politics and economy are interconnected. You cannot separate them. In a democracy, elected politicians govern and formulate the policies which can drive socio-economic development. If this is not there, then there will be problem in the political climate and the economic climate. So there is a relationship between politics and the economy. Then apart from that, the influence of politics on the economy is so monumental that it touches the economic life of every person and business. So this is why investors should be concerned about the possible impact of the 2023 general election in Nigeria on their portfolios and the capital markets in particular. So in concluding, there will always be the elevated political risk that comes with the process of election, the worry of investors, the market uncertainty. Because of the general elections, we raise certain uncertainties. There will also be governance may be abandoned for political and economic decisions, so which is also driven by political expediencies. So many other things. And again, finally, the historical accident indicates that on average, both equities and bonds show positive or negative performances in the penultimate year and immediately after the election. While the drama of general elections can make your imagination run wide, that you need to watch out for how this unfolding scenario will affect the economy, the capital market, and the portfolio. But it may be helpful to stick to a long-term strategy, which is longer than any election cycle, as returns in capital markets are made over a full business cycle, which may be longer than even the one of presidential term, and for investors with low risk tolerance, the safety of bonds can douse their apprehensions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bolarinwa. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, I can hear you now. Yes.
Okay, sir. And thank you very much for your perspective. I think that you have dwelled more on the, if you like, the electoral process as we know it and the factors that generally affect the outcome of the elections. You told us about the economic voting, which is people's choice relative to the economic conditions within the country. In other words, people are likely to vote in accordance to whatever is going on in the economy, how they feel, and that takes us to why vote buying or vote trading kinds of thrives in a country such as ours. It's prevalent in Africa, and we know that we can say a lot about that in things that are happening. You did indicate that in virtually every election year in Nigeria, we had challenges with vote buying and trading, ditto electoral rigging, and that this also manifests in different ways. The Electoral Act has been signed off and is supposed to correct some of these things. So we look forward to seeing the outcome of that in 2023 elections. You indicated about the primaries and the systems, or how the primaries also operate, whether there's going to be conducted direct or indirect delegate for their primaries. We also indicated that going forward, the election results will be transmitted electronically. Hopefully that will make it a bit more transparent. You're going on to highlight the different contenders that we had across the political parties. I think the highlight was also that regardless of what is going on, it's still more, it might be more beneficial for people who are in financial services to take a long-term view of whatever it is they're doing, because the election year has a lot of ups and downs, but ultimately investments about the long term, and we should take the long-term view. So thank you very much, sir, for your contribution and your paper. I think we'll go to the question and answer. So viewers, I would appreciate it if you could put our questions in the chat room. But while we'll wait for a few more questions, I think I have one or two here. Prof, sir, I would like your thoughts around how to encourage the youth, or how we can see youth participate in the 2023 elections. So while there have been many talks encouraging youth to participate in politics, further intensified during the NSAS campaign, and there's so much on social media that there's no polling booth on social media. In previous years, some youths have indicated interest but lost the elections, even at low political levels. So what are your thoughts around youth getting into politics, their acceptance by the citizens, and what are the odds that they can be elected in the 2023 elections? I think this is very important, and I think we need to begin to shape the discussion around this. Thank you, sir. I think you need to unmute, sir. We can't hear you. We can't hear you. Okay.
You can hear me now?
Yes, sir, we can. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. The question is so important because, first and foremost, this is a very young, the demographics of our country is such that by far the majority are young people. Now, if their future is being contemplated without their participating is a dangerous thing for the legitimating attribute of elections. Secondly, young people are the ones who always deliver change to any country. My favorite example is I lived in the United States when Jimmy Carter was president. I was in grad school. He was a wonderful man, but the economy was traveling south. Inflation reached 29% on top of things were so bad. Of course, he lost that 1980 elections to Ronald Reagan. And of course, one of the things that Ronald Reagan did was unleash the American spirit. And that unleashing of the American spirit manifested itself in many ways. One of the ways it did was that when I lived there, when I was in the university campus, March was a period for seniors working on their CVs, getting ready for interviews for jobs that were not there. In the city I lived in, a small town I lived in, Westinghouse had a factory making television that was shut down. People were furloughed and all of those things. And by the time I came back a few years later on sabbatical, young people in April, March were not writing their CVs, they were working on their business plans. And many of them were hoping to become billionaires by the time they were 26. And this changed the course of America. It invented a new economy, the dot-com revolution. And in many ways, I think the youth of Nigeria will do the same for Nigeria, but they have to become involved, they have to become active participants. Part of what I am personally engaged with is to create not social media as such, but a web-based network to get the young people to become involved in the issues around elections and to try and shape the conversation. I think that this is very important for us going forward. Something has gone wrong the last couple of decades. Look, I was appointed advisor to President of Nigeria at 27. The average 27-year-old today in Nigeria thinks nobody takes him seriously. Why? What went wrong in the 40 or 30-something years since that time? We must begin to give young people a sense that they have more capacity today than young people had in my time. We must begin to expose them more. Part of the problem started from politicians, soldiers, because they were afraid of the voice of young people destroying student unions. The training ground for young people for political life used to be the student unions. As an 18-year-old, I disrupted things in this country by challenging foreign policy and getting the foreign minister to come and engage us on campus on why Nigerian foreign policy was traveling in a certain direction rather than another. The typical 19-year-old today does not even understand that he has a voice or she has a voice. This needs to change because really, truly, it is youth who make the difference for a variety of reasons. First of all, they don't have school fees to pay. So they're not as cautious as a 60-year-old who doesn't want to rock the boat because he has to pay next term school fees. And so they're able to be bolder in the dreams that they have. As they say, if at 18 you are not a communist, something is wrong with your heart. But if at 40 you are still a communist, something is wrong with your head. So it's very important for this country that the political class be able to communicate to young people that the country really is theirs and they should be active and they should participate. Some of us have said that anybody who is really serious must say to himself, my cabinet will have, well, I personally, if I were elected next year, 55% of my cabinet will be women and young people. 55%. Because they're the ones who have the energy. I'm 66 years old today. I'm too old to be a minister. I will not accept anybody appointing me one. Not because I don't know what to do, but let the young unleash their energies and get things to happen at that kind of run-around level. I can sit back and give grand advice or be a president or something like that. But we should begin to, when I go to conferences around the continent, I see these 30-something-year-old, 40-something-year-old ministers, young women from Rwanda, and I meet girls in Nigeria 10 times as smart as them. So we need to expand that space, give them more opportunity, and we can build a greater country for it.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, sir. We're really grateful for that. We have lots of questions in the chat room. Our time is far gone. I'm hoping we'll take one or two more. So, Dr. Polayo, I think there's a question on, in the remote event that elections fail, what do we expect? And then a second related question says, are there attempts to provide more security at the polling booth if remote voting is not to be admitted this round? Because that's part of the challenge. We have challenges with security and it's a concern. So I don't know what your take is on that.
Yes, with the new Electoral Act, one of the major advantage of ensuring security of votes, security of lives is this transmission of the results right away, right there on the spot to the INEC server. So there will be less manipulations, there will be less intrigues or altercation at that level. And at the same time, the Electoral Act also made some provisions for physical security of voters, because who will vote if not the voters? So they will have to be well protected, they will have to be well guarded, they will have to be well taken care of. So there is maximum provision through the new Electoral Act for security of lives and property, and at the same time, security of the votes. Security of the vote cast by the electorate. So people are just seriously encouraged. The only thing is that people should just go and get registered, get their PVCs and get themselves ready, and make sure your PVCs are really located within your locality. Just like minimum of 500 meters from your house or maximum of 100 meters from your house, where you can always locate a polling booth. And so that will be also easy for protection and security, where you just move to your polling booth within 100 meters and come back to your house after you have cast your vote.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. I thought you had finished. Okay, thank you very much, sir. I think you have one more question for you, sir. And that would be that given the forthcoming general elections and considering the candidates that have put up hands to contest, what should a business person in the Nigerian market expect in terms of policies and business environment considering the major political parties? You had already indicated before we should take a long-term view, but in terms of policies, what do you think we should expect?
Well, we should, that is where we should decide on who we want. And that is where both the earlier Prof was mentioning where majority of the political parties are not organized. If we have organized political parties, if we have political parties with clear-cut manifestos, if we have visionary leaders being picked by political parties, being elected by political parties via their electoral colleges or party primaries, then leaders who have visions. We need visionary leaders who will give us good policies, not just giving us those good policies to be followed, to be implemented, but policies that will be actualized, policies that will be used. Those who will understand the policies, those who will take the ownership of such policies that will now affect not just the political environment, but also the economic environment, and it will have good bearing on the lives of people and even the environment and the economy as a whole. So we will need the political parties to be more organized. They will need clear-cut manifestos. They will need clear-cut policies that affect investment, policies that affect the economy, policies that affect the people's lives, their property, their investment, their businesses. Those are the people we want. And such policies, so we will need people who will come on board in 2023. People will now follow these policies. You know, when Prof in the earlier time, he was mentioning how he was brought in, chaired a lot of committees, put in a lot of blueprints for past government, past leaders, but eventually those policies were not implemented. They were not used. So all of this will in turn be affecting a lot of things. So when we have clear-cut leaders with good visions, good policies, not just good visions and policies, but leaders who will come on board, actualize them, implement them, use them, then we are going to have returns on every good thing we have invested. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So a few minutes more, Prof. I just have one more question. I'm going to roll two questions into one. The first would be, similar to the question I asked Dr. Brown. I'd like your perspective on it. Is how could we position and prioritize discussions about the economy amongst the major topics and key aspirants for the 2023 general elections? And a second question, we would like your view on the 4-year tenure for the president that we currently have in Nigeria.
Okay, well, on the first one, I quite frankly belong to the group that think the private sector does not do enough to create a better environment for finding the right leaders. Many indigenous entrepreneurs go at night and give lots of money to either the two sides or one particular side in the expectation of favors rather than having a better environment for business, which is very sad. Whereas it is possible that the private sector can support NGOs to even have debates for political candidates to focus on certain kinds of issues. We don't do enough of that in Nigeria, and then we get surprised at what we get. I think the private sector has, I'll give you a very simple example. Again, taking on some point I made earlier about a marketplace of ideas. About 23, 24 years ago, just shortly after President Obasanjo was elected, and things were not going well. President Obasanjo, who I had quarreled with on something, then sent for me to come to dinner. And I came, I thought I was just going to have a dinner with him. Then I found that he had the vice president, the secretary of the government, the finance minister, chief economic, they were all there. And so I started eating dinner. Halfway through, he says to me, "Hey, Mbopat, why did they say things are not running well? Didn't you and I prepare the things?" I said, "It's not whether you and I prepared anything. It is what your team is doing." Anyway, cut a long story short, the effect of that dinner said to me, we need to create atmosphere for more rational, thorough public conversation. It was on account of it that I started a television series called Patito's Gang, so that people who are knowledgeable generally can come and just brainstorm, not brainstorm, brainstorm on issues. But what happened? Did the private sector support it? I've kept it on air for 22 years without private sector support. Simple adverts. In America, they will be falling over to advertise on a show that has so much eyeball and years. But the Nigerian private sector was worried that because people express that the program is express yourself, all sides, anybody just express yourself as freely as you can. We don't want government people to think that we are sponsoring a show that people speak frankly on. So this is a major weakness of the Nigerian private sector. So we've not educated the population, because we should have many of such programs educating people to understand what the issues are. And so I think the private sector could do a lot more if they want a better environment for business. I took it even more closely during the COVID lockdown and all of that. I thought something that can really engage. I created a series, a webinar series on policy called the Nigeria History Series. Let's take policy arena. What went wrong with health policy in Nigerian history? I mean, with health, for example, we have 7 former ministers of health, from Professor Ita Lambo, from where he was in Atlanta, to those here, over 3 or 4 episodes, 2.5-hour series to discuss what went wrong with health policy. If you listen to the series, you wonder, my goodness, every minister had everybody else to blame for what happened. But you can see why we don't have a proper health. We went to manufacturing. We not only took people who had ministers of industries like Jamodu, we brought Paul Collier from Oxford, Kande Yunkela, the former UNIDO. They were all part of this series. A treasure of information sitting waiting. Did we get private sector to support this series? No. So I think that in many ways people make that point that the Nigerian private sector doesn't support an appropriate environment and it expects it. So these are part of the problems that we have in terms of what can be done to improve the environment. It's not only Big Brother Niger and those kinds of things that random people go after that the private sector should support. You should support things that create an environment that improve the quality of governance, that improve decision making and citizen education. Then coming on to the 4-year term, for me, those term things are red herrings. Whether it's 4 years or 6 years or 7 years, the important thing is that the process can throw up somebody that is accountable and somebody who has a clear vision of where they're going and are made accountable. That people can say, look, you said you are going this way. You're halfway through your term. We've not seen travel down that path this much. What's the problem? And you engage those kinds. That's what will make government work. Not whether the man is 7 years or 4 years. The 4-year cycle, of course, what it does is that the first 2.5, 3 years are spent in governing. The last one is spent trying to get re-elected and that kind of thing. So that is disadvantage. But, the fact that you are trying to struggle to get re-elected should be what will force you to perform so that you can ride on it. Unfortunately, the Nigerian politician knows that he does not need his performance to get elected. What he needs to get elected is how much he can steal so that he can distribute the monies on election day or in planning the election. So that then prevents the incentive factor. Economics is about incentives. It's the science of incentives. The incentive factor of doing well so you can be re-elected is lost because the politician knows that how well he does has little bearing on whether he can get elected. Again, we need to reorganize the political process. I am part of a group trying to organize what the media likes to call the third force. And the idea is to put pressure on the system to go from big men to big issues. When our politics moves from the politics of the big man who has stolen billions and can unleash it at elections to the big issues, then it is easier to predict policy environments and to get the outcomes that make for a better society.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Our time is far gone, and I think we have come to the end of this session. And so on behalf of our board and management of Stanbic IBTC, I would like to thank our speakers, Professor Patutomi and Dr. Joshua Bolanyo for spending the afternoon with us. I would like to thank our participants and everyone who took the time to join this session. I believe that we would like to have garnered some useful insights regarding what to expect in the coming weeks and months, and of course position ourselves appropriately. Thank you very much, everyone, and do have a good afternoon.
You too.
Enjoy your day.
Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I think we're done. So.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Good.